All right. So, welcome everyone to our fifth episode of the Sterling Council's 2025 Summer Learning Series. My name's Bob Medeiros, and I'm your guest host, filling in for Dr. Laura McNeil today. Now, last week, Anthony Napolitano took us through a deep dive of the Let's See framework. During this week's discussion, we have Dr. Sampson Gholston, Department Chair for Industrial, Manufacturing, and Systems Engineering at the University of Texas in Arlington. He's with us today to discuss the use of scoring to identify characteristics of organizational maturity. Now, just like other previous sessions, after Dr. Gholston finishes his presentation, we'll summarize the key points and then address any questions submitted through chat. Sampson, welcome.
Thank you, Bob. I will start now. Thank you again, Bob, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for tuning in to our fifth section in this series, which is about scoring. So today we'll pull all the things you've learned in the previous weeks together, particularly ADLI and Let's See. Those are not mutually exclusive, and we'll talk about how we use those in our scoring rubric to score the organization's overall maturity level, and then even down to the process level. So let's get into our session today. So if you think of scoring, scoring helps us prioritize our improvements. Let us know if you think of performance excellence as a journey with a value, say from 0 to 100. It lets you know exactly where you are on that performance excellence continuous scale. And by identifying where you are on that scale, it gives you some insights into the actions that you need to take now for that incremental improvement, for those continuous improvements. So scoring is important for letting us know where we are, what's the maturity of our processes, and then what do we need to be doing next to take those incremental steps. So it builds on the language of maturity that you've seen probably in some other contexts. So if we look down at the organizational level, and this is scalable from organization, department, system, or process. So let's talk about it at a macro level, at the organizational level. If your organization is early in the stage of maturity, that means a lot of your approaches, a lot of your processes are ad hoc. You're heavily relying upon the skills of the people within the organization to get things done. And we've all been in organizations where we know if Susie leaves, then we're going to be in trouble because, a lot of the knowledge will walk off the door. We hadn't captured that into our processes. So whoever comes in next will have to kind of figure it out on their own, and then the performance, can be varied in that sense. So that's ad hoc processes. Every time we perform an activity or perform our activities, almost like the first time we're doing it, we don't gain anything from having the experience of having completed this process over and over again. Reactive means now that we do have at least some performance measures, and we're trying to hit a goal, even though the processes are still not standardized. So we are reacting to when we don't meet the goal. We perform a continuous improvement activity. Hopefully next time we're with the goal, but we find ourselves, fighting a battle of continuously trying to improve this process and find it very difficult to hold any improvements that we may have seen previously. Early systematic, now we begin to have a standardized approach. Now we're doing it repeatedly, over and over again the same way. We can gain improvements based off of that because we have that knowledge of what went wrong or what went right the previous time we did it, since we're doing it consistently over and over again with those same steps. There's a process flow chart somewhere for our processes, or there's a series of those. We have standard operating procedures, and everybody are trained to those. Advanced systematic, now we're repeatable, but we're also now improving those processes. We're continuously learning about our processes based on those key performance indicators. And then based off of that, we're improving the process every time we're looking for ways to make it more efficient or better or faster or whatever that improvement is. And then role model, the benchmark organization, that's the high level of maturity. We're innovating, we're adapting, we're learning, and we become the benchmark organization in certain aspects. People come to us to find more efficient ways to perform those activities. So that's at the organizational level, and then at the maturity as you go from early to role model maturity. Now, if we drill down a little bit, and this might help us understand that a little bit at the micro level, for each process, we can judge the maturity of each process. And in this case, some of you may have seen this type of level 1 through 5 designation and CMMI for software capability maturity model. These um, were made popular in that area, but you can see a level 1 that's kind of like the early stages there. That's when we don't have processes in place. It's ad hoc. The person performing activity really takes different steps every time they perform that activity. Manage, that means we at least have documentation, we're monitoring, we're trying to control. There may be a process capability or a process performance indicator that we're measuring to see how well we're performing. But again, it's really not standardized. We're really not following discipline and following the same steps every time. And then defined. At the defined level 3, for those of you who may be familiar with ISO 9000 or some of the quality standards, this is the position where you have standard operating procedures. It's documented. Everybody's trained to those procedures. And then every time we perform this activity, we follow those very disciplined, detailed steps, so well organized. So you can see the define there, standard operating procedures, level 3, and then level 4, now we're starting to manage those well-documented processes using statistics and quantitative techniques, and we're trying to continuously improve those. And then at level 5, we're optimizing those processes. So we're a learning organization, always looking for ways on how we can improve those processes. So as you extend up from level 1, ad hoc processes, to level 5, you can imagine that your performance is going to improve for that process. You'll have more control of that process. And at the bottom, instead of being reactive in level 1, as we go up at the top, we're going to be proactive, right? So we're not performing the process hoping we're going to meet those customer expectations. At level 5, while we're going through the process, we know that if these things happen, then we can prescribe or predict or guarantee that we're going to meet those customer expectations or the KPIs that we talked about. So that's a little bit of the idea of the maturity level. Now, if you think about that in terms of how can we measure that going forward, what are we scoring? What are we scoring to measure that maturity of the process? So we're not blaming the people in the process. So we're not in this case measuring people. We're scoring the process and its results. So in my previous job as a quality engineer, one of the things that we didn't accept as a permanent corrective action is we're going to retrain the workers, because that implies that the workers were at fault. But if the process allows the error to be made, then we need to look at the process and adjust the process so it can prevent those errors or mistakes or defects from being made, so we can guarantee customer satisfaction. So we want our processes to be robust, and we score those. And where we're talking today, we're going to measure the maturity of those processes to gauge our performance and the alignment. So this reflects in consistency and improvement and impact. So just a quick review, if you the first 4 sessions that we talked about, ADLI and Let's See. So approach, deployment, learning, and integration, that's the ADLI there. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here to remind you, only just to refresh your memory, because that's going to be in our rubric how we're going to score the processes using the Sterling scoring framework as we've have it presented today. So approach, you can see terms like systematic, processes are organized, those kinds of things, which we talked about in the maturity level. I want you to have one thing you get from today's talk is the approach is kind of the foundation, right? If we don't have standardized approaches, then all the other improvements, all the other efforts are going to kind of be in vain, because it's going to be kind of impossible for us to sustain any type of changes without that standardized improvement. And that's where you saw me say on the previous slides that level 3 in that maturity is a requirement for those ISO standards, because that means we have those systematic methods and processes in place that we can improve upon. Because it's hard to deploy something that doesn't exist, right? So if there's no process, then the deployment and learning and integration, those become irrelevant. So that's kind of that foundation. So if you find yourself struggling to maintain improvements, or you're always solving the same problem over and over again, then one of the things you want to look at is that those systematic methods and processes to make sure we're following those every time. So that'll give us the foundation. And then, of course, deployment. Are we using it throughout the organization? Learning, are we continuously improving upon that? And then the integration between the organization. Are we working in those silos where, every department is its own area and there's no integration across the department or processes or systems? They're all operating independently. And then let's see, which what Anthony talked about on last week, if you remember the levels, trends, comparison, and integration. And we'll talk about that when we talk about our rubric, but the approaches, how well are we doing on those approaches, deployment, learning, integration, that's measured by let's see, those KPIs that we have in our results section to show us how well we're doing. Are we average that Anthony talked about? Are we above average? Or are we role model? This gives us that indication once we compare that to our comparators and see where we fall to see how well we're doing. And we'll see those terms come as we talk about our maturity. So just a general overview first on the maturity. So for evaluation ranges, you'll see here in our rubric here in just a second. Just to tie it back to the maturity level, you can see a score of if 0 is the opposite of performance excellence and 100% is perfect performance excellence. If you go from a scale of 0 to 100, you can see 0 to 25, that's early or reactive. That would be the ad hoc processes that we talked about earlier, or an organization that doesn't have standardized processes. And then as we start to define those processes, you can see we can go to a 30 to 45%, but you can see in the consistent, which implies that the deployment, right, is not consistent throughout the organization. We have defined processes, we're just not using them consistently across the organization. And then once we start to use them or deploy them, those defined processes, we move up to 50 to 65%. And then here we start to see more emphasis on effectively evaluating those processes and learning and continuously improving upon those, maybe even innovating to some extent. But definitely when we get to the 70 to 100%, we've got very mature processes in our organization. They're well deployed. They're even aligned and are integrated, meaning that we don't have those silos, that we've looked across those departments, across those systems, and tried to develop processes that are beneficial for the whole system. So in that case, you have a 70 to 100% or role model kind of organization. Now, the way we get to those scores is we use our ADLI component and we look at the maturity of the process. So what I want you to look at here or pay attention to is we use ADLI. So you can see at the end of those sentences, the ADLI, the approach is the first sentence in each one of the categories, then deployment, then learning, then integration. But you'll see at the 0 to 5%, which was the ad hoc kind of processes, there's no systematic approach. So really, if there's no approach, there can't be any deployment of no approach, and we can't evaluate it or have the alignment that we have. So that's a organization that's early stages of maturity. They're still developing those processes. 10 to 25%, now you can see a little bit, we're starting to see some of those approaches become available at a high level. And we even start to deploy those, but it's a lot of variability throughout. And we may even be starting to react to some of those problems that we're having and trying to improve upon those as we go forward. And then we're aligning those within the units, but we still haven't integrated or seeing any significant alignment because we're still working on those basic approaches and processes that we have. So 10 to 25% is where you would see there. Then as you go up, 30 to 45%, now you see the word effective systematic approach. And this is where the let's see will come in. The only way I know it's effective is I got to look at those KPIs and see if I'm meeting those customer requirements or exceeding those customer requirements or benchmarks that we've set up for ourselves. Then I can apply that term. Then you can see now that the approach is deployed, but in some areas, it may be in the early stage, meaning there still could be some variability across the units or departments on how they're applying that approach. But now you start to see some systematic evaluation of those processes and approaches within the department or organization. So that learning, that's your L there, and then the approach is starting to be aligned. So we're trying to break down some of those silos. That's the 30 to 45%. And the difference between the 50 and 65% is now you see that the approaches are becoming less varied throughout the department. You see the term well deployed, and now we have fact-based systematic evaluation that's kind of built in. So we're really evaluating those processes, and improvement is becoming to be more and more important at that 50 to 65% range, and it's aligned across those organizational units. 70 to 85, now you're becoming more and more mature. You're getting up closer to the 4 and 5 range there, as we talked about on our levels of maturities. You can see that we got no significant gaps in deployment, and definitely the fact-based systematic evaluation with evidence of innovation as well as continuous improvement. And now the approach is integrated within the organization. So you can see those. So it's not only aligned, but it's integrated within that organization. And then the 90 to 100% are your role model organizations, and it's well integrated. So very robust approaches. For those processes and organizations, people are trying to benchmark them as the best in class to come and look at the maturity of their processes in the organization. So that's the rubric that we use to score organizations. So that's looking at the entire organization or department or unit. So we're scaling it more than just a single process. We're looking at multiple processes that the organizations has deemed to be key processes in particular areas. And then we're trying to give the best fit. So where does it fall within those, the organization, based on what the organization is telling us is important to that organization. So just to apply that just for a second, I have some scenarios here following up with our reservation system that we've been the thread we've been pulling through for each session. In this case, we have an approach for this particular restaurant. The process is informal. The manager manually records the reservations. There's no written procedures or formal training. There's no automated confirmation, and there's no email. So when you think of this and you think of our little maturities that we talked about before, we're probably at a level 1 here. So if I try to score that somewhere in the 10 to 25% range, right? So that's a ad hoc process. Depends on who my manager and host is or how well that reservation system is going to run. Probably going to have some unsatisfied customers because the reservation was lost, or they still have to wait 30 minutes when they get there because things aren't operating, or they don't have those mature processes in place there, and they're definitely not integrated. We may not have even enough staff or waiters to open up our entire restaurant. So in this case, they have opportunity for improvement. So they need to define that process. So a different scenario. So for this reservation system, notice that the approach for the reservation process is formally defined and documented, right? We can see all the things that we have, multiple access channels from the website to a mobile app to third party, and even open table that we're seeing there. We've seen that it's integrated, or excuse me, we've seen that during peak times, there's a reservation window, there's a wait list, there's a walk-in that we see that's on the approach side. As far as deployment, everybody is trained. There's formal training on this process. No matter who the manager or host is, they're using very similar methods here to make sure that from a reservation standpoint, the customer are going to be happy. Table turns and reservations are managed. We remember Anthony talked about table turns, and we can see that KPI. Now we can manage that within our Adley approach, and that's an indication that we've got a mature process. And not only that, we've got other metrics that we're looking at here, and we're tracking from a learning standpoint and continuous improvement. When we're not meeting our requirement, we can, do plan, do, check, act to improve those. And in some cases, we can innovate. There's some innovations you can see here with AI-based wait list prediction. So we're trying to predict what the wait list is going to be so we can make the appropriate decisions going forward on those. And then lastly, we can see the integration there, which is aligned with our strategic planning process that leadership is looking at. Also is aligned with our workforce scheduling, so we can make sure if we got a lot of reservation, we've got the appropriate workforce available for that. So that process would be on the upper end of our maturity scale, definitely 70 to 100% range with respect to maturity, well-matured process, very high performing. Probably have people coming in benchmarking that particular process. And you can see some of the key features of the maturity of this mature process. It's got continuous improvement culture built right in. There's regular KPIs that we're tracking to judge the performance, to see if it's effective approaches or effective processes that we have. It's documented, everybody's trained upon it, and it's integrated to our whole strategic goals and enterprise system. So the outcomes of that process could be 95% accuracy, 20% reduction in no-shows, et cetera there. So we can benchmark those. Maybe we are the benchmark, but we've got those measures, and then we can definitely make improvement and be more proactive as opposed to reactive there in achieving those measures. And in summary, if we look at just the comparison of the two processes, early maturity, we saw the informal, inconsistent process that was paper-based, no KPIs, versus the mature process that was standardized. Everybody was trained on the process, a lot of KPIs that we were tracking, and it was also integrated into our strategic planning process. So in that case, you can see an example of early maturity and then a mature process. But in between there's a lot of steps, so incremental improvement. So we don't want to say that it's easy to go from early maturity to mature processes, but it is doable through that incremental changes by scoring and knowing where we are and what steps we need to take next. So thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Bob.
Thank you, Sampson. Appreciate that. So let's see if I've can summarize what I thought I heard over the last few minutes. Um, you started off with why scoring is important. It really helps prioritize improvement, encourages continuous improvement, and it builds shared understanding of maturity. You also then went into differentiating organizational maturity level from process maturity levels. When we're talking organizational maturity, you have the early, it has that lack of systematic approaches, it's all reactive, and you might have localized solutions, down through reactive, early systematic, advanced systematic, and ultimately role model, which are highly innovative, very effective, and efficient processes. Therefore, you may be actually setting the bar for operational excellence for that industry, established as a role model presence. When we're looking at process maturity levels, they too are on this continuum of level one being initial. They have processes that are unpredictable, ad hoc, working up through managed processes, defined, quantitatively managed, and then ultimately level five, optimized, where those processes are systematically and continuously improved through innovation and technological improvement. Key point around scoring, it's really a focus on processes and results and not a focus on people. And that you gauge maturity with organizational integration and alignment. Next, you did a quick refresher on ADLI approach, deployment, learning, and integration, as well as Let's See, levels, trends, comparisons, and integration. Then you went to the rubrics talking about these evaluation ranges. Scoring 0 to 25 is early and reactive. 30 to 45 may be defined but not really consistent. 50 to 65 deployed. Either you got some evidence of learning and you're starting to measure. and then 70 to 100 matured, aligned, and continuously improving. You took us to the example of the restaurant reservation system, showing both a early stage process as well as a more developed process, looking at the approach, the deployment, the learning, and the integration. Let's see, some key features of maturity: documented processes that require data on a regular basis. You've got some digital tools that provide efficiency, KPIs you brought up, and recognizing stakeholder feedback, uh, integration across the enterprise, and continuous improvement, and really a focus on outcomes and benefits to the customer. Now, you mentioned that maturity requires that enterprise-wide standardization that is data-driven, that there's automation through tooling, these organization-wide adaptation of KPIs, key process indicators that are, or key performance indicators that are systematically monitored. And then when we get to integration of those products, those processes across the organization's systems and strategic objectives and goals. How how close was that to a summary, Sampson?
Very good summary. Very good.
Okay, all right. I have a couple of questions for you here. The first question: who in the organization should be responsible for assessing the maturity and or scoring the organization?
So, so definitely you need to be knowledgeable about the rubric. So if you're so you want to have a scoring process there, but I would suggest that it's somebody that doesn't have a vested interest in the process and organization, just for biases sometimes can creep in, but somebody that's definitely knowledgeable with some kind of rubric. So if we're using the Sterling rubric here, so examiners, that's one of the things that they're knowledgeable about. How do you apply that to assess those processes? And if you can remember the difference between the less mature restaurant process and the mature process, those kind of bulleted items, those are the things that you're looking for to figure out which range that you're in, and then you're able to give a valid assessment for the organization. And in that case, for the reservation system.
Okay. So let me ask you, how often should the organization be scored?
So at the organizational level, it would be again depending on the maturity of the organization. So I would say somebody starting out early in the process, you might want to score more frequently because the changes, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, so to speak. So you are making changes and you want to make sure you're progressing in the right direction. For a more mature process where uh, they're really refined, high-level improvements that you're suggesting, it may take some time for you to see the impact in those. So they may go a couple of years for those organizations to be reassess maybe on your strategic planning cycle. You may use that information as part of your strategic planning process. But if you move down to the process level, then, as we indicated in the presentation, the high performing organizations are continually assessing those processes. They actually built the assessment, that learning piece, into the process itself, and they're constantly updating and improving those.
Okay. Hey, I've got one more question for you. Um, what if some processes are role model while others are less systematic or repeatable? How would you go about scoring that?
So for examiners, that's something we see commonly because not all processes are created equally, right? So in that organizational profile, the organization tells us what's important to them. What are their key processes, right? What are their core competencies? And when we look at those, we got a little bit higher mark. We want those to be more mature processes because you're telling us that's the core of your business. Now, other processes that may not be as important, then those may not be as mature because you're not spending as much time on those. So if you've got all the key processes, and they're mature, high performing, then we'll lean toward the higher end of the maturity scale. But if the opposite is true, if you got a core process and it's not mature, and you're not seeing those things that we talked about in relation to a level 5, then as examiners, we might give you a lower score on that to say, hey, this is important. You're not doing this well. Focus more of your attention here to make sure that that process, since it's a core part of your business, you want to make sure that you've got high performing processes in that area. So it's kind of the discussion that goes on to assessing the final score.
Very good. Well, Sampson, I want to personally thank you for sharing uh, the scoring the story, the maturity guidelines. It helped make some sense out of the scoring rubric and understanding how Adley and Let's See kind of play in. So thank you for your support this hour. I just want to remind everyone that next week, Roland will be back with all the presenters of the entire series, as well as Dr. Laura McNeil. This final episode will kind of be a review of the entire series, so you don't want to miss it. Thank you again, Dr. Gholston. We appreciate it, and that's all for right now.
Thanks, Bob.